Welcome, everyone. Excited to spend some time with you guys today on a topic that has been hot and getting hotter over the last few years, which is machine learning. And specifically, taking less of an academic and more of a practical approach of how we actually did this at a real Fortune 500. So we're going to talk a little bit about a lot of different things today, but the overall objectives that I'm sure you guys are familiar with from before you came here is essentially we're going to look at kind of the systematic evolution from descriptive to predictive and predictive to prescriptive through the lens of one set of frontline analytics projects that I was able to be a part of and drive at Verizon. We're going to talk about how an analytics team evolved our HR data from kind of disjointed and siloed to integrated in a way that could leverage analytics for turnover, performance, hiring, and those sorts of things. And then we're also going to talk about an intro to very basic machine learning techniques and how they can be easily applied in your organization. The good news is I am not a statistician. I am not a computer scientist. We were able to do these things just from our experience and our background in HR, and my background is organizational psychology. So we're going to kind of start with the abstract and sort of move more down to the specific. A little bit of philosophy on HR analytics and how it works from my perspective, a little bit about how we move the needle from an analytics perspective at Verizon, and then specifically what we did with machine learning and some of the stuff that worked and frankly some of the stuff that didn't. So this is our level of attack here for our 30 minutes that we're going to be talking. We have some this is the content. We have some questions, some polling questions we'll have you guys jump in on as we go through the day. So these times may get inflated a little bit, but really excited to make this a participation session. So ask questions, participate in the polls, and get involved, because that's going to make give everybody the most value out of this. So we're going to talk a little bit about Comcast, me, and the team that I sit in. We're going to talk about the foundations for the advanced, so how we've aligned some data structures, a little on philosophy, the data ecosystems, and how we sort of built stuff. And then finally, some early wins in machine learning. So kind of what is it? What is some of the stuff we tried? What is some of the stuff that worked and didn't work? And sort of what the next steps were. So for an introduction, the first thing you'll notice is that for a very brand-conscious company like Comcast, we don't really have much branding going on. And that's because currently I work at Comcast, but the work we're going to be talking about is from Verizon. So I didn't brand a Comcast because it's Verizon work, but didn't brand a Verizon because I don't work there anymore. So we're going to keep it kind of brand neutral today and talk about the work that I did do while I was working at Verizon, and specifically in wireless. But the company I sit in now and the work that I do today is supporting this amazing company called Comcast, which you may or may not have heard of. It's very big in the U.S. and is growing internationally. But what we do is provide a whole suite, the whole end-to-end spectrum of in-home media, which is both, I like to say, the pipes and the water. Right? So companies like Verizon are infrastructure. They get stuff to your house. And then companies like Disney or Fox create content, right? The water in the pipes that helps, that brings you the stuff that you guys like to enjoy. Comcast does both. On the cable side of the house, we bring you Xfinity Home, all kinds of infrastructure for media. But then the NBC Universal side of our house has a lot of these brands that you recognize, from NBC to Oxygen, Sci-Fi, Golf, Telemundo. And then we also have films. So whether you love Minions or you hate Minions, you're welcome. They're a very successful franchise and people love them. But that's all Universal Studios. And then we also have parks. If you've ever been to Universal Orlando, we have a park in Tokyo. So we have a very broad set of different types of people we have working here. We have literally people picking up phones in call centers, and we have people designing roller coasters. It's a very broad base of employees, but very cool, huge footprint across the United States and the world. So very proud to be a part of what we do here. Myself, my background, I've been at Comcast a little bit over a year and a half. Some other experience I've had at big companies. I started my career at PepsiCo, where I spent time in learning and development and talent management and org development. At Verizon, I was in selection strategy, so kind of in the TA space, and then moved into HR systems and analytics. And in Comcast, been specifically focused on HR analytics. I've worked at small companies, consulting, and then also have some professional affiliations, because you'll find as we go through, I'm a not so in the closet nerd when it comes to data and people science in general. So my academic background is in spaces like person-environment fit or communication, frontline performance, generational differences, and what we're talking about today, which is machine learning. So up at the top right here, I love to talk to people, so you can find me either at that email address, at LinkedIn, or if you want to come to Philly, I'll be happy to buy you a coffee, because I love talking about this kind of stuff. So the world I sit in at Comcast is essentially like this. We have Comcast NBCU, which is this giant behemoth, 160,000 employees. And we have some enterprise functions and COEs that sit across the top of the whole thing. We then have we sort of bifurcate the org into NBCU that's operating on its own and cable that's operating on its own. We have geographic divisions that handle our frontline needs. And then we have HQ functions and cable COEs that sort of support those geographic divisions as well as the overall cable group. I sit in technology, product, and experience, which means my people, the people that I support, are about the 8,000 scientists, engineers, customer service folks that design the technology, product, and experience for our customers. So we've brought together the scientists and engineers and the testing ground for all of our customer care to be able to help work with the divisions to help advance everything from building new technology like a remote control you can talk to, which won some awards last year, all the way through how do we route calls more effectively so that people get what they need faster from the customer service organization. So that's the world that I kind of live in and support now, and I do all the HR analytics and reporting for that 7,000 to 8,000 person organization. So, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. That's a little bit about who I am. Let's talk about HR analytics. So the first thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about philosophy, positioning yourself in the ecosystem, and adding value while you're showing value. And this is important for when we get to machine learning because the machine learning stuff doesn't just come out of the ether, right? It's built on top of a solid infrastructure that has to come from somewhere. So this is how I think about how HR analytics adds value. It's sort of a basic thing that I show to anybody that wants to know why we're doing this analytics thing. Why has this train left the station? Well, it's left the station because we have all this data that's living out in the world of a given company, and we have to bring it all together and streamline it. Once we have it, we actually have to explore it and understand it. Once we understand it, we use it to describe, diagnose, or predict outcomes, right? That's the idea. We're trying to get competitive advantage out of it. Once we understand that, we actually have to present it in a way that people understand it. So communicate is the next stage. And then we make a decision, right? And we act. And when we act, the idea is that we affect the data that we originally pulled and we see some sort of change. This is sort of a corporate version of the scientific method, right? But in our world, this is really the analytics lifecycle. And if you're doing analytics well, you're getting the data, you're understanding the data, you're showing people the value, they're changing the way they do business, and then that changes the data that you're pulling, right? And you get this big cycle of ways that we're adding value to an organization. So the next thing I'm going to talk a little bit about is how HR analytics is classified. But this is a great place to jump in and get you guys involved really early. So if you had to put all of the different things you do as an HR analytics practitioner into buckets, how many buckets would there be, and what would you label them? All right. So across, and how many people are we talking about here, Shane, total?
That's 29.
All right, excellent. So roundabouts 30 folks. We've got the majority of us sitting in this 6 to 10 bucket. Almost nobody said 1 to 2 things, so I think that's probably fair. And a few of you, I'll say the cynical minority, saying we do more than 10 different things because honestly, we do get yanked in a lot of different directions. So I'm with you there. The way that I would like to frame it out today, and this is the way that I pitch it with my stakeholders, is I break it down into 5 distinct buckets. And I'm going to talk through them a little bit from a philosophical perspective because how the work is classified is different than how the work gets done, but it's more of a taxonomy for thinking about how we build the foundation. So infrastructure to me is the structures, tools, and architecture that we have, right? Data warehouses, metadata that we create, software interfaces that exist that we use to store, manipulate, and access data. This is the true back-end part of the backbone of where we get our data. Sitting on top of that is what I call governance, right? So this is the rules of engagement. It includes definitions, refresh schedules, calculations, ethics, ownerships, jurisdictions, and all of those things. So once you have your backbone developed, you actually have to manage it. And that's where the governance part comes into play. Sitting on top of those 2 building blocks is guidance, right? So this is counsel and support that you provide to users about workforce data to help them either access, report, analyze, and just generally use their data well. So this is when the HR business partner walks into your office and says, I need a, right, fill in the blank there. We help them solve business problems, right? At the end of the day, that's our job. To me, the top 2 pieces on the pyramid are reporting and analytics, which I think are distinct, and I define them that way. Reporting is giving people information, right? Accessing, visualizing, and delivering data to or on behalf of a user. And then analytics is interpreting data for people. So analyzing and interpreting data, which sometimes includes research like forecasting or simulations. The difference here is reporting is how many people quit last month, and analytics is why did people quit last month. very different asks. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but I like to call out the difference because it's very different work, it's very different math, and you have to do different things with your data to make that happen. So that's how I classify HR analytics work. So I try to say we do 5 things within our HR reporting and analytics function. So let's talk about how that sits in the ecosystem. Because the HR data system landscape, we're not going to get too technical into the IT realm of the world. Frankly, I don't go that deep, but I do think it's important to understand that ecosystem, because when you start talking about using more advanced analytics, understanding it is really important. So where these 5 things sit is across this sort of presentation or this spectrum from very less technical, the presentation layer, which is what your users see, all the way down to the back end, which is your actual data. And I use the refrigerator, kitchen, and table analogy here because that resonates with most folks, right? Your data is the ingredient sitting in your refrigerator, right? The business later is where we're taking it out and we're preparing it in some way for somebody who's actually going to eat the food, which is what ends up on the table. And those 3 kind of general categories are where analytics practitioners have to ebb and flow between to do the work that they do. The users in IT fit in sort of this very nice, clean space, right? Users and super users almost exclusively live at the presentation layer. Even the biggest super users typically are just very deep into some software package that they're pulling data out of the system. The rules, the governance, the actual data lives with IT. Different forms of IT, looks different from company to company, but by and large, typically you have this pretty clean cut between users and super users, and then all of the people that write code. At the end, that's sort of a way to oversimplify it a little bit. Where we want to live when we're talking about staging and building data from an analytics perspective, you kind of want to live in between those 2 groups. This is where your stat comes in. It's where your validity and your infrastructure show up. So if you want to create metadata and say there's only one way to calculate turnover, if you go and do it in a presentation layer, it's only going to be good for whatever reports it is you're running. You can push that a little bit further upstream, get that buy-in. All of a sudden now you have a slightly higher standard. I'm wildly oversimplifying this, especially at big companies. But the idea is that the ecosystem flows, and if you can live kind of in that space between IT and super users, it's a very healthy place to allow you to flex in both directions, which is very important. So if you think about what this means from a practical space, right, these are the sorts of business partners that you would deal with, right? HRBPs, finance, legal, the business, they all sit at that user space. HR operations, HRIS, centers of excellence like talent management get a little bit deeper into the data and float a little bit closer to the back end data. You live in that middle space, and then you have to be that bridge between the world of those folks and the database administrators, the software engineers, the technical project management. So when you can get comfortable into that space, and this is what we did at Verizon, we had a direct connection to a small IT team that was helping us, and then we also had direct connection to the business users of our data to be able to validate and facilitate ultimate usage. Now the story gets more complex, right? Because it's not just like we have one set of data at a company, especially one the size of Comcast, right, or Verizon. You sometimes have these, refrigerator to table analogies for multiple different systems. You might have one for your demographics. You'll have one for your TM or performance management. You'll have one for comp. You'll have one for applicant tracking. You might have one for learning and development. You might have one for applicant tracking that's completely outside of your organization that gets piped in. So the amount of silos you have across is not to be underestimated, and oftentimes makes things very challenging. And that's kind of where our story about our evolution towards machine learning really begins. This is an actual slide that we use to kind of pitch the data evolution that we developed at Verizon. Going from left to right, you see at the bottom there, we're going from raw data all the way over to consumable data. On the left-hand side, we had non-HR Verizon wireless systems, which is where our retail sales performance lived, our customer service performance lived, our survey data lived. One more piece about this is that specifically we were doing retail and customer service frontline data. So we were pulling their performance data, which we didn't ultimately have jurisdiction on to start with. It lived in the business units. And we pulled it into our HR data warehouse, so we were able to align it to our quality of hire survey data. We were able to align it to all of the HR data that we already had jurisdiction over it. When you talk about experiments and research design, you have independent variables, which are things that you're putting into the front of the model that predict stuff. And then you have outcome variables, which are the things that you're ultimately trying to influence. the way that I shared this with our stakeholders was, all of our dependent variables, all the things we're trying to influence, right, like performance metrics, mostly live outside of our jurisdiction. We have a ton of good independent variables in our HR systems, but if we want to actually do cause and effect conversations, if we actually want to get to advanced analytics, we need to bring all those good descriptors and put them in the same house, right, as the outcome variables that we were trying to predict, like performance, for example. Once we have that feed automated, we were able to clean and combine all the information and sort of tie it all together. One for retail, one for customer service. Once we had all that data in kind of one super table or two super tables, we were then able to add our own flavor to it. So then the things about, I call it metadata. So saying, hey, I want to lag particular variables, or I want to add particular definitions or particular calculations. All of that couldn't be done until we had all of our data together. And so that's kind of one of those last steps to add those calculations and standard statistics that we wanted to use to evaluate the data. And then from there, right, the last step is we output it to whatever tool we want, right? Once you do all of that work, the cherry on top is, well, do I want it to go to Cognos for a dashboard? Do I want it to go to SPSS for some sort of statistical analysis? Do I want it to go to Tableau so it becomes a pretty chart for people to be able to filter? But all of the stuff underneath the water, right, is that sort of alignment, which was a huge part of setting up our world. So the next polling question is, so we've talked a little bit about how we classify work. We've talked a little bit about sort of the data ecosystem and how that work sits within that flow of different types of information. My question for you guys is this yin and yang of to give or to build. And if you spend time in HR analytics, you know that it's always, am I teaching them to fish, or am I just giving them fish because I don't have time to build it? So my question for you guys is, what do you think you should do first? Do you think that you should deliver short-term wins to make sure that your constituents understand and show your value? Or two, do you build systems and processes that ensure valid insights, right, and create sustained competitive advantage? All right, we got an engaged bunch today. All right, I love that we have a split here. I was expecting it, honestly, to be a little heavier towards the sustained competitive advantage. That's initially when I first got into HR analytics, being a very analytical and detail-oriented person myself, I very much leaned toward, we got to build it so it works forever, right? Working smart is more important than working hard. And I learned pretty quickly that you need to do a little of column A and a little of column B. If you over-index towards governance and infrastructure, you lose the WIFM factor, right? You really lose people seeing this, what value you're bringing, because the work on the bottom part of the pyramid is extraordinarily unsexy. And I'm sorry to say it like that, but it is. It's tedious. Some people love it, but it's really, really important, but it doesn't really show business value. And in organizations where things are moving fast, things are constantly changing, being able to give them things while you're building things is important. When I came into this organization about 1.5 years ago, I didn't even talk about infrastructure and governance for the first probably 6 months because I was very, very busy showing them why they spent all of this time and headcount to bring a team together. They wanted to see some wins. Typically when an organization is built, it's because there's pain that needs to be alleviated. And you need to start to alleviate some of that pain, which sometimes means you're going to be putting the cart before the horse a little bit. I'm not saying totally over-index because that's not a sustainable model, but the extent to which you can show your value by delivering some short-term stuff will get you the buy-in, it will get you the sponsorship, it will get you the funding to do the governance and infrastructure stuff once you have the street cred, frankly, with your organization to get it done. So how do we actually do that? So we're getting away from the philosophy now and talking a little bit more about how we actually did this at Verizon, and then we're going to talk about machine learning. So when I was brought into Verizon in 2013, essentially I was brought into the selection strategy and operations team, and what they said was, we need you to help us do quality of hire better. And what that meant was they wanted us to validate our assessments, because they were saying, hey, we have these assessments that are coming in, and we have to stay EEOC compliant. We need to make sure that these tests are actually predicting. And so what they asked for was make sure our pre-hire assessments are working. And what they actually wanted was an objective way to evaluate hiring tools. But what they needed that they didn't have was reliable, valid, and clean data to feed to all the people that needed it, right? They needed an objective, simple way to explain whether or not their assessments were actually working. That grew into standardized quality of hire. So as we're doing these assessment validations, we're starting to pull data from these retail systems. We're starting to pull data from these customer service systems because we have to feed it back into our talent acquisition data to be able to see, right, when we give if people that score this on the test versus this on the test, what was their average calls per day, right? What was their retention like? What was their revenue generation like, et cetera, across all the different performance metrics. As we started doing that, what they said was, okay, well, why don't we also talk about whether or not we're doing TA well? So in addition to making sure the assessments work, the next natural step is, are we hiring people today more effectively than we were yesterday? So for that, what they really wanted was an objective way to evaluate hiring decisions. And what they needed was a valid means to compare new hires to each other and the rest of the organization. So in the first step, we were pulling these data sort of ad hoc from our performance systems and dropping them in to do these assessment validations. We were now saying, hey, well, we also need to understand the difference between what a new hire is compared to other sorts of folks that float around the frontline organization. So now we're adding this new part to our data set. And at this point, the data is still living on laptops. It's still living on shared drives. It hasn't really been systematically implemented yet, but it's sort of growing because the steam is picking up because the assessment validations went well, and upping our game from a quality of hire perspective, they said, hey, you have all this performance data, let's do quality of hire with it. To which we said, you give us time and money, we can do anything you want. The following year, we moved into this space of automating dashboarding because we've whet their appetite now, right? They see the quality of hire stuff coming out, they see the assessment validations, and they basically say, this is great, I want it now, I want it faster, I want it more frequently, I want it cut 17,000 different ways. And we said, we can do that, but there's only a handful of us, because what they wanted was more and faster, but what they were really saying was they need a model whose speed wasn't limited by the small number of super users we have, right? You never have enough HR analytics people to have a one-to-one relationship from user to person. It's always lower than that, which means you have to build models and systems that will meet that need. So when they said we want more faster, we said, well, you can hire 30 more people, or you can give us, right, the heads, the time, the funding to go off and build stuff that's going to not be limited by the amount of people that we have on this given team. So we use the excitement around the stuff that we had built to start to move it into the space of IT. So that's when we really start building our relationships with information technology to say, hey, the business loves this quality of hire thing and they need it every month. They need it every week. They need it cut 17 different ways. And now it becomes a technical project and something that starts to get institutionalized. And that turns into where we actually get to this predictive turnover space. So they didn't really ask for this. They didn't really know what they want. And the reason for that is the stuff that we did from a predictive perspective, honestly, was empirical support for business insights that they already fundamentally understood. Our business partners know a ton about their data intuitively. They know a ton about their people intuitively, but by and large, they didn't have the data structures or systems to really be able to provide empirical proof and evidence for the things that they were saying. And so the predictive stuff built on top of that, because once the data jumped that big chasm from sitting on a laptop in a share drive to being a technical project that was regularly refreshed and governed, it was a much smaller step to say, okay, well, now let's tweak that to be a machine learning model. So as you look at the building the bridge while you cross it from going the bottom, so we started kind of at the top and worked our way down the pyramid, is this, right? So what we actually built to start with were these little prototypes. We were grabbing little pieces of data here and there, putting them together and creating buzz and excitement around the insights we were generating. Following that, we were able to do slightly bigger prototypes because they were saying, this is cool, can you do more of it? And now we're prototyping in Excel, we're prototyping in SPSS and SPSS Modeler, we're playing around with R, and we're showing them, hey, this is what we could do if we had the time. That builds into the first data models, which is our first jump into the IT space where we're spending time with folks. And then finally, we get to move into slightly more advanced stuff once we have our footing and our grounding in the relationships with IT, who's really maintaining these systems. We've sort of come to the end of the part, excuse me, where we're talking about kind of how we did this at an abstract level at Comcast. So the next poll question that sort of closes this section out is, if you could remove any one obstacle impeding the maturation of your HR analytics function, what would it be and why? We have a list of a bunch of different things, and you'll probably want to click more than one button, but this would be an exercise in prioritization for you guys. So we have some folks living, nobody asked for executive support or user buy-in, which is I think, legitimate. The reason for that, I would guess, is likely because this train has kind of left the station, right? We did a couple of presentations at conferences. The first one was building an HR analytics function, and then the follow-up 2 years later was, okay, now what, right? This train has kind of left the station. These teams are growing organically. Some of them are more centralized, some of them are decentralized, but it seems like most companies are on board with the fact that we need this work to get done. What they haven't figured out just yet is where I think we see at the top is they don't necessarily understand how the sausage is made, right? They know the work needs to get done, but they're not quite comfortable throwing the amount of heads and the amount of dollars at this work to move at the speed that they want to move. It maybe resonate with some of the folks on this call where they'll say, hey, we need a dashboard, and we'll be like, that's great. And they'll be like, yeah, can you have it by like Friday? And you look at them and you say, this is connecting like 6 different data sources with 12 different cuts that's owned by 7 different groups. So no, we can't have it by Friday. And they just look at you like, aren't you just going to like do some Excel magic and we'll see a dashboard fall out the other side? Because I agree. I chose different skills because I think that that's kind of the space where we're most lacking. And then at the bottom end, one of the places that I also definitely see gaps right now is in the user skills and technical support. HR as a function right now is evolving. For the last 30 years, HR people have not had to use data. And there are a lot of people still living in HR spaces that aren't necessarily comfortable moving in that direction. And so we have a pretty, I think, healthy bell curve. About 10% of people are really stoked about this. About 10% really, really are avidly against it. And then everybody else kind of falls somewhere in the middle with regard to whether or not they want to and or have the ability to do this work. And then tech support is something that is being built. I think HRIS kind of lives in this world right now, but building those connections between the super heavy technical and the super user is definitely growing. So thank you guys for weighing in on this. All right. So we are at 11:03. Shane, you think about 10 minutes on this, is that right?
Absolutely fine, yeah.
All right, cool. And that'll leave us about 20 minutes for conversation at the end. So early applications of machine learning. We're going to talk about what it is, some of the stuff that we've done. Again, I'm not a statistician, so I'm going to keep this reasonably simple and high level. I'm going to explain some of the basic stuff that we've done, what worked, what didn't work, and how we used what we talked about previously to kind of build on top of that infrastructure that we created. So first, this is a question on top of anyone's mind. What is machine learning? It is one of those things that is widely defined by a lot of different people. Even if you read through the Wikipedia page and then go read 3 different books, you'll get 3 kind of different answers. So I've trolled the internet and the literature to try to kind of understand this. And I see a couple of main patterns. So this is not an official definition, but it's things that I look for when I'm trying to understand whether or not something qualifies as machine learning. And at the end of the day, folks, it's just semantics, right? Business people want you to solve their problems. They don't care whether it's labeled machine learning, advanced analytics, computational statistics. That's an academic debate that is somewhat irrelevant to the practitioner's life. But when you're looking for guidance about how to do this work, understanding how people label this work is kind of helpful. And so these are the characteristics that I see when I talk about machine learning. First of all, it's looking at data for patterns. It's attempting to predict something. It gets better with more optimized data. And it's not explicitly programmed. So if you look at the images we have here, it's searching large amounts of data. It's trying to predict something or show us something or give us insight into something. It's somewhat, at least semi-self-directed, which is an important piece because of the quantity of data it's usually looking through. And it's feedback or big data oriented, meaning that more data or optimized data can help you get to a better answer. So those are kind of the 4 pillars that I tend to look at when I talk about this kind of work. So let's talk about the business case. Verizon, another behemoth company, could fill MetLife Stadium in New Jersey 2.5 times with all its employees, which means that every 1% turnover in our world equates to 1,800 plus losses, right? Which hurts us from a loss production perspective. Because we have overtime, we have ramp up of new employees, we have handling volume issues, and also separation and backfill is not an inconsequential issue, right? So dealing with the exit processes, the interviews, the training and onboarding, there's a huge amount of time and money and effort spent backfilling people, which is a legitimate cost to the organization in time and financial resources. So what we started to do is we used something called exponential smoothing. If you have a finance background, you may be familiar with this, but essentially what exponential smoothing does is it looks for temporal patterns across your data with good variance, and it can use those temporal patterns to forecast population level behavior. When you're talking about frontline call centers and frontline retail, they tend to be very seasonal, which means that hiring and turnover both happen reasonably predictably across the year based on things happening in your business, right? If you sell a lot of stuff, you're going to be very busy in November and December in the United States, right? If you don't, if you have a heavy college workforce, you're going to have a lot of turnover in August, right? These sorts of things in frontline workforces manifest temporally and predictably, which means exponential smoothing can look at your data over time and say, okay, July of this year is going to be more similar to June of this year than, say, November of last year. But July of this year will probably look more like July of last year than maybe June or May of this year. So it can take year over year as well as proximity and use that to create a forecast moving forward. Most software that does this kind of stuff, Alteryx, SPSS Modeler, those sorts of things can do exponential smoothing models. And you can feed your data in and use your independent variable as your dependent variable. This is an actual model of how we were predicting turnover. And about 3 to 6 months out, we were able to be producing with 90% accuracy and almost 95% from an overall yearly perspective. So if someone was going to lose 200 people over the course of a month, we could tell them you're going to lose 200 people, plus or minus 10, which was very valuable for us. One of the watchouts we saw was that bigger wasn't necessarily better. Adding more than 2 years to 3 years worth of data kind of weakened the model because the further back you go in time, the less those temporal models hold up. So for us, we found an optimized middle ground that really helped our predictive validity for this model. The thing about this model is that it works at scale, right? The temporal patterns of the variance go down as your group gets smaller. So when the amount of people leaving was smaller than 150, the variance wasn't big enough to be able to predict. So if we were predicting for a whole division, let's say, that had several thousand people and were losing several hundred a month, that predicted very well. But if you went down to a particular call center that was only losing 30 people a month, the model didn't work as well. And so obviously, we always want to get to the lower levels of prediction. And so one of the ways we tried to influence that was to do something called hierarchical modeling. And so hierarchical modeling is exponential smoothing kind of applied in a few different ways. So if we take a big model, like a whole division that has several hundred terminations in a month, and we create a model about that, it might predict, hey, you're going to have 17 terminations next month. Then we go run that same exact model for all of the different, let's say, regions within that division that have smaller amounts of employees. And they're going to predict what they think about the given model. But we know it's going to be less accurate because it's much smaller. And so we can take those, add them all up, and then compare, okay, this region is going to be 32% of the turnover, this is going to be 21%, and we compare the models to one another to say, hey, we think that the relative turnover is going to be reasonable. Then we take the number 17 that we think is more accurate than 14, and we multiply those weights to give us new predictions. So instead of predicting 4.5 for region 1, we predict 5.5 because we think 32% of 17 is going to be more accurate than 32% of 14. So this is a way that you can take exponential smoothing and make it a little bit better. For us, when we did this, it didn't hurt the models at all. It didn't make them worse. And we thought that we could do a little bit better, be a little bit more sophisticated with it in the future. But it didn't really help us, honestly, in our first pass. It's also a bit of a pain technically and mathematically to deliver because instead of managing one model that you're feeding back, into your HR information system, you're now feeding, 6 or 7 or 10 that all need to be managed and refreshed month over month. So it can be a little bit of a hassle. The golden goose, of course, for this is individual risk prediction, right? So how can we predict not just this group is going to lose 30 people, but is Tommy leaving? Yes or no? Is Mary leaving? Yes or no? Is Janice leaving? Yes or no? So we wanted to start to look at things like decision trees, logistic regression, to see what sorts of things might work there. And I will tell you that this did not work well, and we did not ultimately succeed in this space in my time when I was at Verizon. So we tried to put the data into a binary outcome model. using things like logistic regressions and decision trees. Didn't work. Made everybody show is staying, because the amount of people staying is huge compared to the amount of people leaving. We tried to create a proximity determination using a regression saying, how close are you to leaving? So using a continuous outcome, a tenure to turnover rather than yes or no. That didn't work either, because it also showed everybody is staying. Then we tried to put the two together and create an ensemble method and say, okay, let's try to predict if you're leaving or not. And then if we're confident that you're leaving, then try to do a proximity determ and see what kind of risk you are for leaving soon. That also didn't work. It was predicting now. It wasn't showing everyone is staying, but it wasn't better than a 50-50 coin flip, which if you're not getting better than 50%, you're not really doing all that much on a binary outcome. This is what that kind of looked like, attempt 3. This is an SPSS modeler flow where we were bringing the source data in. When we go to the left, we were training to see, are you going to leave, yes or no? Dropping that in. Going to the right, we were saying as a continuous output, how long it is until you're going to leave, if we're assuming that you're going to leave. And then we apply the people that we think are going to leave to the models about, are you leaving, and then seeing what comes out. And honestly, it didn't work. But that's part of science, right? Failure is a giant part of innovation. And so I don't think we failed. We just found the first way that didn't work. And that's kind of an important, I think, thick skin to kind of have when you're doing this kind of stuff. But that was kind of our first foray into the individual risk prediction. Something that people often like to ask about is neural nets. Why didn't we use them? Why haven't we talked about them yet in the things that we tried? Two main issues that kind of inhibited our desire to use neural nets, maybe something for more advanced in the future. But two main inhibitors. One is so many different possibilities. When you're creating metadata about your data, oftentimes there are an infinite number of ways you can massage your data. You can lag data, like saying, okay, we think turnover is going to be correlated with hiring 2 months ago, which means you have to take all your hiring data and move it 2 rows down to show the connection between those two things. Or the 17,000 different sorts of Z-scores you can calculate for a given individual against people that are like them in tenure and people that are like them in gender and people that are like them in marital status, and over and over and over again. And neural nets, pop culture doesn't really talk about this stuff, but neural nets don't do all of that stuff for you. You have to understand how you want to put your data together so that you can do that kind of exploration. And it's very time consuming because first you need to understand the soul of your data, and then you need to do all of that playing around. And it's a big scale to do that type of work. The second is kind of too little data, because neural nets get stronger when you have more use cases. And even at a company the size of Verizon, with the thousands of terminations we had every year, we're still only talking about tens of thousands to maybe 50,000 records that are usable. When you go, remember, when we go back more than 3 years, the validity kind of falls apart a little bit. So we have longitudinal restrictions, and then we're only left with 20 to 50,000 records. The training and validation groups just aren't big enough. So the way we're going to unlock this in the industry is when we get to start putting it all together. Or you work at a company that does call center for, that's hundreds of thousands of people, and you can make that data much, much bigger. In our scale, with the amount of data we had to work with, it just wasn't big enough to really leverage the power that neural nets bring to the table. So the wrap up of this, and I think it's 15 minutes rather than 10 minutes, so I apologize, is smoothing worked really, really well for population level predictions, right? We were 90 to 95% accurate for groups that were terminating at 125 plus a month. If you've got good seasonality or other record-to-record patterns and good variance, this is a great idea. It's easy to implement. Lots of value from a funnel perspective. A lot of stuff on the front end of turnover. Knowing workforce planning, workforce forecasting, media spend to keep your funnels full. Great business wins there. Hierarchical modeling, kind of sort of worked. We think it could get better. If you're having real trouble with smoothing, hierarchical is a good way to go. Ensemble methods didn't really work all that much. We think if you spend more time working on this, you may be able to ferret out a solution. Most of the commercialized predictions I've seen are basically glorified logistic regressions, and they don't really do all that much. And then from a neural nets perspective, we didn't do it because, frankly, we didn't have the size of the data, which is the biggest rate limiting factor with creating good neural nets. So with that, we sort of started, right? We've gone back and started with our our overall philosophy about how this work gets done, moved into a slightly more specific application of how we built some of that infrastructure at Verizon, and then talked about how machine learning sort of sat on top of that infrastructure to help us bring some automated wins from a predictive capacity for the wireless organization. So the last polling question before we jump into questions and conversations is, I want to know, from what we talked about over the last 45 minutes, what are you guys going to do on Monday that you haven't done before, which you heard about today, if anything, right, which will help your organization move toward building or using advanced analytics in HR? And Shane's got a couple of examples for us, for you guys to pick through. Cool. I will connect with people that I haven't engaged before, and then everything else is kind of sort of in the middle there. So I like that idea. I'm on board with that because I think one of the biggest parts of HR analytics and its development is the PR that we need. The top brass understands the need for this, right? They have started to build these organizations, sometimes centralized, sometimes as organic growth around the organization. But getting ourselves connected with the people that own all of the data that we don't, getting connected with finance and IT and HR information systems and all the different COEs and all the different people doing your types of work in other parts of the organization is really creating that network. It's going to be that connective tissue that's going to help HR analytics mature across as an enterprise function, which is kind of the direction I see this going over the next 5 or 10 years. So with that, thank you everyone for your engagement and for your answering of the polls. And I'm going to hand it back to Shane to facilitate some Q&A.
Thank you for a great presentation. My name is Salvador Malo. I'm the Global Head of Workforce Analytics for Ericsson, which is also a pretty large company. And one of the challenges that we have faced, especially in recent times, is something that you mentioned already, which is the lack of understanding of many of our shareholders regarding what can and cannot be done in a certain time frame. And you said about a dashboard that needed to be ready by Friday. Well, that's an example of a more general phenomenon, which is that people tend to think of analytics as a black box where magic happens, and they really struggle to differentiate between what takes a long time to do and what is really straightforward. And sometimes people will approach me asking for something that I can literally pull out of a spreadsheet in 2 minutes, and they say, can you do this by next week? And it also works the other way. People approach me with what they think is a simple question that takes forever to answer or would take a 2-month project. So can you share any success stories regarding how you have dealt with this sort of challenge? How do you educate people so that they become more realistic in their expectations?
Yeah, so I will start with two points. The first is what we are dealing with now as HR practitioners is something that information technology professionals have been dealing with for about 30 years. So I often lean on the expertise of IT folks because they know this world inside and out, because the majority of people are still not IT professionals. And so understanding when I was at Verizon, how does IT work at Verizon? Now at Comcast, understanding how IT works at Comcast, those cultural and developmental principles are critical to getting this type of work done. And they have been great guides and you could say kind of culture coaches for me to help kind of set those expectations. So from an org to org perspective, getting with them and understanding how they triage is a big one. The second point, which is kind of a 2-point thing in my opinion, is building street credibility as a prelude to creating a prioritization list. So, business stakeholders understand roadmaps, right? They understand annual goals, and framing lifts in that kind of paradigm helps them, and that framework helps them understand. So if I've got a team of 2 people and I have support from 4 people, I can do this much each year, if I have 10 people and I can do this much, I can do this much each year. And this goes back to our earlier question about which do you do first, the governance and infrastructure or the building of stuff? Because as you deliver more and more things and you deliver more and more high quality, I have found that business leaders are far more inclined to believe me when I tell them that something's going to take a quarter to develop. That said, being very transparent about that list and all of the things on the list is very helpful. I had a manager that taught me back at Verizon. She was a great mentor. She had this list of things, and it was typically about 15 things long. And when something came to her, she would literally print it out, print out the new thing, bring it into her boss's office and say, which of these 15 things do you not want us to do because you want us to do this? And that facilitated the conversation of what's a realistic timeline here for all the different things that we're juggling, because even if this thing is only going to take a week if we do it, there are 30 other things that are only going to take a week that you asked about last week. So I think getting the culture and coaching from IT, who's been dealing with this problem way longer than us, and B, using your street cred and a really transparent road mapping process to really help them understand the volume management.
Sorry, I was talking on mute. Thank you. Great answer.
Are any of you guys facing a similar challenge to Salvador? I would love to hear your feedback, guys. Chris, Yvonne, Muriel, because this is something that I hear quite often. And it would be nice to know if you're going through a similar sort of experience here.
Yes,
I
will just say yes, thank you again. Of course, that's typically the kind of a challenge we are facing. A very big urgency, because we see the final things that we could achieve, and we have a strong tendency to jump and dream on all the possibilities we could have. So this presentation today is really clear to engage the right conversation, to prioritize, and to make it become more realistic. So it was a very good question from Salvador. Thank you very much, because we are struggling the same issue. The key question of having enough diverse skill around the table, and also elaborating the good process to define the clear priorities. So along the month, we are getting better and better. And across the paths, we are having our project getting shorter and shorter, or with small pieces, because we realize each day that it's a very long road, and we need to be much more precise on the roadmap and defining the framework. So this is why it's a very insightful presentation.
Can I add one thing to this, Shane?
Jump in, go ahead, Chris.
I would like to reshare, if I could, quickly, this, and I literally shared this with my stakeholders. Bill Strahan is our Executive Vice President. He told this story to us at our HR Analytics Summit this year. He said a man in a hot air balloon was lost. He reduced his altitude. He descended a bit more and shouted, "Excuse me," when he found a person. "I've gotten off course. I don't know where I am." The person replied, "You're in a hot air balloon. You're 30 feet above the ground. You're between 40 and 41 degrees north latitude and west longitude. You must be a lawyer," said the balloonist. Bill is a lawyer, so he feels comfortable poking fun at lawyers. He said, "I am. How did you know?" And well, said the balloonist, "Everything you told me is descriptive, specific, technically correct, but entirely useless." And when we talk about HR analytics and the types of work that we do, one of the ways to triage that roadmap is to think about it in this framework. Are you really getting something that is bringing business value, or did you have a thought in the shower about some dashboard that may or may not actually help you get where you're trying to go? And talking, and I see smiles on the video feeds because you guys deal with this every day, and helping business leaders learn what is value-added data, meaning data that gives you information, versus just more noise that isn't really moving you forward. Very helpful way when triaging your roadmap.
Salvador, a couple of, this is Cody Martin from Johnson & Johnson. I'd say 3 quick things. One would be have a steering committee that kind of reviews large projects and prioritizes them. I think one area that we're not really good as analytics folks is putting being able to estimate how much time something would take. But what we've done is you take the pyramid that Chris showed earlier about like advanced analytics, advanced reporting, simple reporting, or insights, and then you have your team figure out how long on average those take, and it becomes like a menu that you show your clients and say, you just asked me for this, this is how long this takes, and it's going to go to our steering committee and we'll determine. And then the last thing I would say is for each of the groups that you support, have one point of contact that filters all the requests through that person, and then those people will start to see that they've asked you for 3 things and they'll start prioritizing for you. So those are the 3 things that we used at J&J. I used at Bristol Myers Squibb, and they've helped out a little.
Thanks, Cody.
Hi, this is Chris from Philips, HR business partner, and thanks a lot, Chris, for your perspectives on this. I think one area to me that's very interesting is a lot of times we use the predictive analytics, and it's kind of like, what are we trying to drive there? And in some cases, if you look at terminations, then we're trying to understand so we can make sure we do the staffing properly, and maybe it's more sometimes an input for the talent acquisition teams and the managers to prepare for that, and also to think about how they do knowledge retention and those sorts of things. One thing that I think we struggle with still is a lot of times we're looking more on the lagging indicators, and then how we use the analytics that we're looking at to start thinking about not even trying to prove causation, but at least correlation around some things, so people can be saying, hey, are we okay with the 10%? Maybe that's okay, for a particular group. That's what we should expect, and let's just plan around that. Or if we think that this is, out of whack, what are those things that are driving people? Why is this number bigger than what we think it is? Is it because the job market's hot? Is it because there's a problem with some of the managerial staff that the teams don't like the managers? Those kinds of things that tie back. In some cases very much to employee engagement, but they can also tie back to market factors and all those other things. And I think certainly for us, that's an area that I don't think we're quite good enough yet. It's still more on the reactive side, I think, even though we're predicting better than we were.
Yeah, getting comfortable with baselines is really critical, because we often find things that we want to talk about, or we come up with metrics that we want to quantify, and then we quantify them and they look back across the table for me and go, well, is that good? And you might say, well, I don't know if that's good. You asked for the data, right? And creating that education about, well, okay, we're going to start to look at time to start, or we're going to look at overall, tenure at termination. And I think our job as HR practitioners is to help them think more critically about the data they're asking for, right? Not all turnover is bad, right? That's something that's not super intuitive, right? One of the things we did this year is we were talking about open rec age, right? So how long is a requisition open in the TA space? And I said, well, our time to fill, if we handle all of our old recs, it means that our time to start is going to go through the roof. So if you want to handle all of this garbage sitting out in our TA system, we're going to see inflation in our time to start. Don't freak out about that, because we're handling a different issue. And non-analytics folks don't really get into the ebb and flow and the relation between those things. And I think it's on us to help them think through what they're asking for, so that they can create an intelligent perspective and then carry that with them, right, in the teach them to fish kind of model.
Yeah, maybe we could connect at some point, Chris. We got some ML guys looking for internal passive candidates. So their algorithm kind of triangulates words that are used in kind of our internal LinkedIn system, and goes into a dictionary and looks for every variation of a certain word, and then the frequency of those words used and in conjunction, and then kind of organizes a list of internal talent, so that the business cases, it illuminates talent that leaders could consider when filling a role that they don't have a network with.
Right.
And so we're about to move into the real ML piece, the feedback loop, where, a user would vote, and then, you would wait for a certain number of votes on good match, bad match to collect before the ML guys take the system down. That's the big learning for us around ML, is that the machine isn't actually learning on its own. Like a person's making the machine learn.
Right.
So they would take it down, and they would kind of use the votes to then create weighting, and then, the false positives would get lower in the list. So that's kind of internal candidate search is something that no vendors are really doing the way we're doing it right now. So we're kind of doing it on our own.
That's interesting. Do you work with Adam Meyer by any chance?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I know him, so we should do lunch and talk about that.
Yeah.
Because I think you're just over the river, right? You guys are like New Brunswick?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I will find you on LinkedIn because that sounds very interesting. Well, we can't ever cover everything, but I feel good that we had some good conversation, and it seems like a lot of us are fighting the same good fight, right? I think the industry has decided we're going in this direction. They've started to throw heads and dollars at this, though they haven't really figured out how or how much they're throwing it at. And so we're seeing a lot of storming and forming and norming of these sorts of efforts across large organizations that are decentralized, getting more centralized. And so I was very excited to hear everyone's perspectives today and to see the polling questions. And it makes us feel good to know that we're not alone in the work that we're doing here. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity to connect, Shane. So thank you to HRD for keeping this whole group going this year.